processes and good habits to protect water quality in your community. My name is Clara Tyson. I'm the Biodiversity and Watershed Program Coordinator for the New Brunswick Environmental Network, and myself, along with Julie Cormier, the Executive Director of Vision H2O, will be your hosts for today. Before I pass the mic to Julie, I want to go over some technical notes. So the presentations today will be in English, however, Julie will be speaking in French. If you require interpretation for either language, please follow the instructions on your screen for how to use the interpretation feature on Zoom. So encore en français, si vous avez besoin
If you need interpretation today, please follow the instruction on your screen.
And you're fine listening in either language, you can remain here in the main channel. And when you're asking questions, please feel free to ask in the language of your choice, either English or French. If the presenter needs translation or vice versa, we'll provide that for you. And on that note, a big thank you to JC, our interpreter for today. Sorry, I just had to meet someone. A big thank you to JC, our interpreter for today. If you're going to be using the interpretation feature, you will hear his voice, so make sure to thank him. And further, we will be recording today's presentation, so if you don't want to be recorded, please turn off your video. However, for the discussion portion at the end, we won't be recording that, so we encourage you to keep your mic and your video on for that. So now I would like to pass the mic to Julie.
Merci, Clara. Donc,
Thank you, Clara. As Clara mentioned, as it was mentioned by Clara, I work for the Capelé and Beaubassin watershed in southeastern New Brunswick. As a watershed people, we work for the protection of soft water. The soft water, I talk water, the groundwater, lake, stream, brooks. We're happy today to talk about the underground water, the groundwater. For today, the workshop will go as follows. We'll have the first presentation on groundwater. Afterward, we will talk about the impact of the land, what we can do on the land to protect the quality of the water, as well as some techniques, activities we can make, either barrel water, barrel to keep the quality, to protect the quality of water. There will be a question period of 5 minutes after each presentation. We'll try to go as fast as possible, but don't worry. At the end of all the presentation, we'll split you in small groups. We have breakout rooms, so it will allow you to discuss, ask more questions. We really want to encourage a discussion for different teams of today. If you have teams to propose, to put forward for the small breakout room, we encourage you to do them in the chat. So we will take note of all the issues, and then we will deal with the issues at the end of the presentation. Before we go on with the workshop, I would like to take one moment to remind you that we are on the traditional unceded Mi'kmaq territory. I talk about the Mi'kmaq territory on which I find myself since I live in Groundwater, New Brunswick. But I invite you to take a moment to think of the native people of your region. Today, we will talk about water. So over the last few years, I participated in a few meetings and to learn more about the traditional songs on water. These knowledge show us how important that resource is for our community. I encourage you to seize the opportunity to learn more if you can. This will give us a new opportunity. Without any further delay, we will start the first presentation with John Sons. So John is a senior engineer in environment and hydrogeologist in underground water and in contamination for Escape Services Incorporated. He has more than 30 years of experience in several projects, the private, First Nation of Canada in Ontario, and the Canadian Arctic. He also worked in some international jurisdiction. So the presentation today will include a discussion on groundwater, the system of groundwater, contamination, source inclusion of salt water and the shore water, as well as other interesting issues that I will allow him to present. Without further delay, John, the floor is yours.
You're muted, John.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. Well, my French is un peu, and I'll just try and get through this as best we can. So today I'm going to talk about groundwater in general, sort of an overview of the principles, groundwater flow systems from a conceptual point of view. And then we'll look at, in brief, southeastern New Brunswick region, which I think would interest more people. I'll go over some of the a high-level overview of contaminant hydrogeology and common contaminants, groundwater protection, and then we'll look at an example, if we have time, of an aquifer vulnerability assessment that EXP had done for the former Royal District Planning Commission, which is now the Sussex Regional Planning Commission, and I'm not sure what the number of that is. So let me just get this up here. There we go. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, so groundwater. Just by way of outline, we'll look at the groundwater principles, move into groundwater flow systems, look at the Southeast New Brunswick groundwater resources region. Again, an overview of groundwater contamination, protection, how it's regulated within the province. Again, a very general overview from my perspective as a consulting hydrogeologist. And we'll look at an example of an aquifer vulnerability assessment, which was a fairly unique initiative undertaken in the province by, again, the former Royal District Planning Commission, and hopefully we'll have a little time for questions. So I've got quite a few slides here that I've put together from various talks over the years or work that I've done over the years, so it may be a little rough in sections, but again, we can clarify any issues in the questions. So groundwater principles. Well, what is groundwater? Obviously an important part of the hydrologic cycle. It can be thought of as that part of precipitation that seeps downward until it reaches soil or rock material that is saturated with water. The water in the ground is stored in spaces between soil or rock particles. And contrary to popular opinion, there are generally no underground rivers or lakes. That could be argued for certain types of terrain, in particular karst in like limestone areas. Groundwater generally moves slowly underground at a downward angle and generally will eventually discharge as seeps or flows into streams, rivers, lakes, and oceans. It can occur close to the land surface as in a marsh, or it may lie many hundreds of feet below the surface as in some arid areas of the West. Water at very shallow depths might be just a few hours old. At moderate depth, it may be hundreds of years old. And at great depth, or after having flowed long distances from places of entry, water may be several thousands of years old. Typically, from a potable water supply perspective, we are mostly interested within the upper 100 to 200 meters of the subsurface. And I would say in general terms, again, strongly dependent on the nature of the material, groundwater would move at a rate of centimeters to perhaps meters per year in a higher conductivity material. We develop groundwater from wells, obviously, and from aquifers. And we can generally define in general terms the two main aquifer types as number one, unconfined, or a water table aquifer, where the upper surface of the aquifer is the water table. Here it would be, again, this upper zone here. And the second main type is an confined or artesian aquifer, which is an aquifer immediately overlain by a low permeability unit, what we would call an aquiclude. And then there's variations, I guess, that we have leaky aquifer conditions, where an aquifer receives recharge from cross-formational flow through the confining layer. So we might see the unconfined, if we pump this confined aquifer, we might see some groundwater leaking through as we pumped. And then there's perched aquifers, which are more local. They're unconfined aquifers at higher elevation than the regional unconfined aquifers. And these might be tapped by, say, shallow dug wells, which are not very often found, but certainly by our forebears were used fairly commonly. And they would typically be dug in the superficial deposits, which are in this area are mainly glacial tills. Just to introduce the concept of porosity and permeability, most groundwater is found in billions of pores between mineral grains or in fractures, and its occurrence and availability depends on the porosity and permeability, or typically permeability in hydrogeology, we talk about hydraulic conductivity, therefore how easy the groundwater will move through the formation. Again, permeability is a measure of how readily water will flow through the materials which constitute the aquifer or aquiclude. In a coarse grained material, the pores will be generally much larger and wider apart. In fine grained material, they'll be much closer together, and in clays, they'll be you may have good porosity, but you'll have very low hydraulic conductivity or permeability. So high permeability does not always go hand in hand with high porosity. Often from a groundwater supply perspective, the questions are, why are certain areas better or worse for groundwater supply? And the answer is, depending on the hydrogeological setting, as we'll see later on, whether we're in a good or a poor aquifer area. Why can it be difficult to find suitable well yields? And that comes back to the aquifer type and the aquifer conditions. For example, in fractured bedrock aquifer systems, we can see great variability in terms of quantity and quality of groundwater. This is just a schematic illustrating the difference between the fractured bedrock aquifer versus a sand and gravel aquifer. So here we can see a very coarse grained, high yielding sand and gravel in a buried valley aquifer with large cobbles and stones deposited by the stream versus, say, a fractured bedrock aquifer, whereas unlike the sand and gravel aquifer, which we might think of as a fairly uniform sponge, as it were, the fractured bedrock aquifer is dependent on the number and the hydraulic conductivity of the fractures encountered. So if we hit a number of fractures with good water bearing capacity, we would typically find a high yielding aquifer. Some of the better examples of these are found in the Shediac region. However, if we say are in the Salisbury Formation around Petitcodiac or Salisbury, where the name comes from, we have a fairly tight rock and we might only hit one or two fractures, and we can have a very low yielding well. And we see this, in the municipal water supplies, where typically we'd want wells on the order of, say, a minimum 100 to 200 gallons a minute or more. And in Salisbury and Petitcodiac regions, this can be very difficult to find. Moving on to groundwater flow systems. Groundwater flows due to differences in elevation and water pressure. Hydraulic head may be thought of as the height of the water table. So if we move, say, from a stream at low elevation, as we move to progressively higher elevation, the hydraulic head will increase. And it's the difference in head which is the driving force for groundwater to move, again, from high hydraulic head to low hydraulic head. Hydraulic gradient is the slope or steepness of the water table. And it's basically the difference in head divided by the difference in distance between the 2 points of measurement. So groundwater always flows from a region of higher hydraulic head to one of lower hydraulic head. And the groundwater velocity, all other things being equal, increases as the gradient steepens or increases. This, we're looking at a very simplified conceptual model of groundwater flow systems. So typically what we see, for example, if we went from the shoreline at Shediac westward toward Moncton Dieppe region, we would see the ground going from sea level and increasing progressively as we went inland. So when we look at this from a regional perspective, we generally think in terms of shallow, intermediate, and deep flow systems. So a shallow or local flow system might be around a small creek or a brook or a small pond or lake. And we have small areas of recharge which discharge to the small stream or the lake. For larger features, such as, let's say, the Shediac River, we would see a larger flow domain, as it were. Recharge from higher area goes to intermediate depths and is discharged eventually at the intermediate discharge zone. And then, of course, the deeper flow system, we would see recharging higher upland, going to some depth, and then discharging ultimately at the regional discharge feature, which would be the headwater or the Shediac River at Shediac or along the Northumberland Strait or the Shediac Bay proper. So again, just a very simplified conceptual model of groundwater flow systems. So how do we look at these from a hydrogeological point of view, which ultimately leads to considerations of protection and management of groundwater? My colleague Fred Beckler in our Sydney office has done extensive work in Cape Breton, where he's essentially mapped the whole island in detail and applied sort of an approach to characterizing different hydrogeological regions and settings. So we start with the basic geological units. From those, we piece them together or differentiate them into hydrostratigraphic units. Therefore, the individual units which control the type, quantity, and direction of groundwater flow. And then we piece these individual hydrostratigraphic units into block models, which we essentially identify hydrologic regions and districts. And from a, figuring out where the water goes, we sort of add water either from a conceptual model, which essentially is in our heads, or just, from our general knowledge of groundwater and geological conditions. And in the last, say, 30 years, numerical modeling techniques have been widely applied. So these are some various diagrams of different hydrogeological or hydrologic regions that Fred has developed for the Cape Breton Island region. And these can be essentially translated into much of the terrain of New Brunswick, because we have a lot of similar geology. And this, as we'll see at the end of the talk, is how we approached looking at aquifer vulnerability assessment for the Sussex region. So looking at southeastern New Brunswick from the perspective of groundwater resources, New Brunswick is has fairly complex geology. Essentially, we have the younger rocks in eastern New Brunswick, represented by the light tan color, which is what we call the maritime basin. And this would be the main maritime basin north of Indian Mountain / the Kingston Uplift. And then here to the south, we have what we call the Moncton Subbasin. And then to the northwest, to the west, and to the south, we have much older and much more complex rocks. This is a sort of a blow up of the southeast New Brunswick region. Again, the Moncton Subbasin is what we're looking at here. We have bounding to the north what we call the Kingston Uplift, a higher area along where Indian Mountain is. And then to the south, we have the Caledonia Uplift, which again is much older rocks. And then the younger rocks here would constitute the Moncton Subbasin and including the Westmoreland Uplift. These rocks here, the Westmoreland Uplift, are some of the younger rocks in the area, more flat lying and similar to the rocks of Prince Edward Island. And they have some of the better potential for aquifer development. The GSC did a study, it was back in 2008. We helped them with some aspects of it in the field program. And this is a sort of a block model around of the Moncton Subbasin, showing from Petitcodiac through to Moncton. What we see again is the very old basement complex rocks at some depth on the order of 2 to 3 kilometers. And the more complex, the older and more structurally deformed rocks to the representing the Caledonia highlands to the south and the Kingston Uplift to the north. Again, we see here, I'll just point out the Rishabukto Formation, again, some of the younger rocks in the region, and the Salisbury Formation. The Rishabukto Formation is quite a good, has quite good aquifer potential, and it starts roughly in the Moncton Dieppe area and goes through to Shediac and beyond. The Salisbury Formation is, again, I think the characteristic for formation from which that would name would be the Salisbury, obviously, and it's generally a much tighter rock. It can be very difficult or variable in terms of aquifer conditions. This is a piezometric map, which is basically a groundwater elevation map for the bedrock aquifer in the Maritimes Basin, which the GSC developed in their 2008 work. And essentially, we're looking, these arrows show the sort of the general direction of regional groundwater flow. So again, in the Kingston Uplift area along Indian Mountain, very high groundwater flows from high areas to low areas toward the coastline. Here at around Moncton, it's a little more subtle in terms of elevation, but generally we have a flow divide, say from Moncton through to Sackville, roughly, and groundwater from the Dieppe Moncton region flows towards Shediac and then discharges at the Northumberland Strait. The GSC also overlaid the geology, looked at the well logs of the area, did some pump tests in different formations, and came up with this map, a very general map of aquifer types in terms of good aquifers, which are the dark blue region. We can see again, Shediac area is one of the better aquifer regions. And here, as we go into the main Maritimes Basin, up towards Harcourt and Miramichi, also generally good aquifer conditions, but a little more variable I've found in practice. Here in Salisbury, Petitcodiac, we see the poor or variable aquifer conditions, And certainly that's been shown from attempts by various municipalities in the areas in terms of developing larger yielding water supply wells. So again, a sort of a general overall regional map of aquifer potential. This was an interesting exercise completed by the GSC, Geological Survey of Canada, during their study. And they developed sort of a representative water budget for the Maritimes Basin, which would include the Moncton Shediac area. So if we have, say, a precipitation on the order of 1,100 millimeters per year on average, 48% of that goes as runoff to lakes and streams and into the Northumberland Strait. 38% is evapotranspiration. And on the order of 13%, again, a very average number, it'll be higher in some areas, say upwards of 20 to 30%, and lower in other areas, say downward to 5 or 10%. So again, this was sort of a representative average number is as groundwater recharge. A couple of interesting numbers are their estimated groundwater withdrawals. So only on the order of 0.05% is being withdrawn from the aquifer or from the groundwater flow system. And another interesting number is the storage. Again, we're looking at the upper 100 meters, which would typically be what we consider potable water aquifers in the area. And they estimated that storage would be on the order of 5,500 millimeters, which is interesting, would be roughly 5 times or 5 years of annual precipitation. So again, a lot of storage, and overall, relatively not a lot of groundwater is pumped out of the aquifer. Now, that being said, the geology is complex, and in certain areas, intensive well development will withdraw locally a lot more than this 0.05%. So again, just a sort of a general hydrologic budget for the area. Here, well, we'll look at this later, but we can see the ocean or the salt water and the freshwater saltwater interface, but I've got a couple of more slides to illustrate that. An overview of groundwater contamination. Well, some of the main sources, I think, as we'll all appreciate, are underground storage tanks. Typically, these would be gasoline in our area. And we can differentiate between gasolines, which we call L-naples. We'll look at this in a later slide, and D-naples. L-naples are light non-aqueous phase liquids, therefore they float on top of water. And D-naples are dense non-aqueous phase liquids. And each of these will behave in different ways if it leaks into the subsurface. In the past, with L-naples, such as gasoline, we had lead additives. Again, these were phased out some time ago, but they were replaced at one point with a chemical called MTBE to serve as an anti-knock compound for gasoline engines. And MTBE has been quite a problem in certain areas of the States when it leaks, because it can move quickly in groundwater and is highly soluble. Other sources of contamination, obviously agricultural land use, which would be fertilizers, where nitrates has become a problem or can become a problem. There are certain areas on Prince Edward Island, for example, which is intensively developed for agriculture, where nitrates are high. And then, of course, pesticides and other fertilizers. Failed septic systems can be a problem. We have a lot of older buildings where septic systems weren't installed to the standard of design we have now. And then, of course, dump sites and landfills. And if we have time, we'll look quickly at our approach here in New Brunswick to those. Sort of a schematic showing different sources of contamination. Again, we have septic tank drain fields, We have infiltration from agricultural land use. We have older dump sites and various other forms, obviously, for potential to contaminate the aquifer. Generally, our focus is on surface or near surface source contamination, but there are deeper contaminant sources such as upward migration of deep groundwater into shallow aquifers. And we don't, of course, we don't see it now in New Brunswick, but the potential for shale gas fracking and saltwater intrusion due to overpumping at depth. When we talk about contaminant fate and transport, we generally look at we can break it down, I guess, into these categories: free phase product, which would be, say, gasoline floating on top of the water table, pure phase gasoline, generally more local to the immediate source where it was spilled or where the tank leaked. Dissolved phase plumes, which is essentially the gasoline dissolving into the groundwater and then migrating by advection or groundwater flow. Vapor phase, where it volatilizes into the unsaturated zone in gas form. Groundwater discharge to surface water can be an issue. And a lot of these issues in recent years are managed through ecological and human health risk assessment. And the Department of Environment has implemented the Atlantic Risk-Based Corrective Action Framework for managing risk from spills. Conceptual model of a contaminant entering an aquifer. We can see it flows downward through the unsaturated zone and then spreads out once it hits the water table. A key point is that groundwater contamination can be extremely difficult and expensive to clean up. And often, if it's in a fractured bedrock aquifer, this is even more complex and many times impractical. You just often have to step off and develop a new clean source from upgrading groundwater. This shows the main processes for contaminant fate and transport. We have a source at surface, infiltrates down, hits the water table, dissolves into the groundwater. The groundwater flow carries it by advection. As it moves through the subsurface, it can be degraded by chemical transformations, which in some cases can lead to one or more different what we call daughter products. And some of these can be more toxic than the original contaminant. We have aerobic and anaerobic bacteria can biodegrade the plume. And we have diffusion and dispersion of the plume. And volatilization through the unsaturated zone back up to surface. Again, this slide just to illustrate the difference between LNAPLs, like non-aqueous phase liquids such as gasoline, and DNAPLs, dense non-aqueous phase liquids, which were one of the more ubiquitous sources was dry cleaning chemicals. TCE, this sort of thing, or degreasers used in the machine shops. So in the case of an LNAPL, I'm not sure my cursor sometimes shows up, sometimes it doesn't. But if we get a leak, it goes down through the unsaturated zone, might deflect off a lower permeability lens. The free phase product will again, by gravity, keep migrating downward until it hits the water table. And since it's lighter than water, the free phase product shown in black will float on the water. And then we'll get a dissolved phase plume developed from that. In terms of a DNAPL, again, very much more of an issue and very difficult and expensive to clean up. We don't see much DNAPL here, it'd be more in Ontario and industrial sites throughout the US and in Canada as well. But what happens is you get a leak, it goes by gravity similar to the LNAPL, but it hits a low permeability lens, will sort of flow off that, continue migrating down. It hits the water table, but in this case, it doesn't stop because it's heavier than water and it keeps going down. So this can be an extremely difficult problem, if not impossible problem to remediate. We have aside, again, the gasolines issue has been, I would say, in large part addressed within New Brunswick. In many jurisdictions, they've removed the older single-walled tanks, put in double-walled tanks, and monitoring wells immediately in the tank excavations. So we don't see that as much of an issue these days. Household fuel tanks can be an issue, but again, the insurance companies, now that they've seen how expensive it is, tend to have much more stringent regulations in terms of how long a tank can be in, and even moving towards double wall tanks. In terms of new and evolving contaminants, we have what a certain class of compounds called PFOS and PFAS, and I won't even pronounce those in full, but a typical example, which is fairly widely used, would be firefighting foam suppressants. And they're used as well in a number of different applications. In the US, this has become quite an issue, and it's just huge amounts of dollars needed to clean these compounds up, because they can move fairly quickly in groundwater and are not subject to much attenuation. Pharmaceuticals and personal care products are becoming more of an issue. Again, more so in Europe, I think, where this is first evolved or was identified as a potential issue. And then we have microplastics. So just some of the evolving contaminants. And again, not a lot of work has been done in the Maritimes looking at these, to my knowledge. I know at some sites we've looked at the firefighting foam suppressants. So just looking at coastal aquifers, which again would be fairly typical of our region, particularly along the southern New Brunswick coastline. And generally what we see is where the fresh water from land hits the salt water from the sea, the salt water is more dense. So it flows under this fresh water and forms what we call, due to say tidal activity, a zone of dispersion, where we get a transition from the salt water to the fresh water. Now again, fresh water is lighter than salt water, so the fresh water floats on top of this wedge. Here we're looking at what can happen to upset the balance of that equilibrium. Here under natural conditions, we have the fresh water, the salt water wedge beneath it, a zone of diffusion or transition zone at the boundary. If we put in high production capacity wells, but what can happen, we can overdevelop the fresh water, leads to a lowering of the water table, and the hydraulic head from this denser salt water will push the salt water inland. If we are really over pumping, we'll lower the head in the fresh water such that the heavier salt water will be move up and contaminate the freshwater aquifer. I think we've all heard about climate change, and obviously in this area, one of the main concerns is sea level rise. And here, a diagram developed by the Atlantic Climate Adaptation Solutions Association, looking at saltwater intrusion and climate change, showing under static conditions, the location of the saltwater freshwater interface. And as the sea level rises, the salt water again will push itself further inland. And if we had a well, we can see that the well here, which at one time had just been pumping fresh water, is now tapped into the saltwater wedge. So as sea level rises, there'll be more and more of a potential for this, particularly for wells close to the shoreline. I just wanted to touch briefly on dump sites and landfills, basically two different solid waste management facilities. Dump sites historically had operated in New Brunswick, say up until the 1980s, 1990s. And in the 1990s, the government of New Brunswick really moved ahead with developing regional containment landfills, such as the Berry Mills facility in Moncton. So again, I mean, the whole rationale was to move away from this open dump sites, which you might find, say, in an old gravel pit that had been operated by DOT, and there wasn't a lot of thought, I guess, as it were, into protecting the environment at that time. So again, beginning in the early 90s, the province of New Brunswick, and I would say one of the leaders in the field, really, from my perspective, when I look at other jurisdictions, moved to engineered containment landfills, and much better organized and managed. Obviously, a significant cost, but a significant environmental benefit as well. So, the way we build these things, we excavate down to subgrade. If the soil is suitable, we'll recompact it into, say, a 2-foot soil or clay liner. And then on top of that, we'll place a containment liner, which is basically heavy-duty plastic sheets welded together, very resistant to a typical municipal solid waste leachate. The site is sloped when you excavate the subgrade to drain to a low point, shown here in the at the low end of the slides. There's the complete liner system installed. At the center, we place a pipe which drains by gravity down to collection manholes, where here's the working surface that we place just to help the leachate drain to the center pipe. And then that's once it's drained, it's drained to and sent off for treatment, either in a municipal system or a dedicated leachate treatment system. There's monitor wells placed around the facilities, and there's environmental compliance and operational monitoring. An overview of groundwater protection in the province. Well, within New Brunswick, generally all the regulations fall under the Clean Water Act. This is just a sampling of some of them. The Environmental Impact Assessment Regulation, the Water Supply Source Assessment Guidelines, which would typically apply to a subdivision in a non-serviced area or a proposed subdivision development. We have the Well Field Protection Designation Order, which applies to municipal or public water supply wells. We have the Contaminated Sites Management Process implemented by the Department of Environment through the Risk-Based Corrective Action Framework. And then there's other regulations such as the Water Well Regulation, which licenses well drillers, for instance, and the Petroleum Storage Product Regulations. An overview of the environmental impact assessment process can be quite detailed. A lot of my experience is in municipal well development and in subdivisions and non-incorporated areas. So when we do go to develop a new municipal supply well or a new subdivision in a non-incorporated area, we will do a water supply source by the Department of Environment. We submit an initial application, typically under an supplements an EIA registration. And if that's approved by the department, we will go out and do field investigations to prove the technical feasibility and sustainability of developing groundwater in that area. And an integral part of this whole process is public consultation. Moving on to the Wellfield Protection Designation Order Regulation. What that does, it's a requirement for new public water supplies that Environment has implemented over the last 10 to 15 years. And what is done, you model protection zones around the production well. So typically you would have a Zone A protection zone, which might represent a travel time of 250 days to the well. Then you would have a Zone B, which is, I believe, 5 or 10 years travel time to the well. And then you have an outer Zone C, which is a 25-year travel time to the well. And that would be, again, the Zone A is to protect against microbiological contaminants, which are, would break down theoretically within that time period. Zone B is the petroleum hydrocarbons, which can break down but take a much longer time. And the Zone C is for the more, typically would be to protect against more persistent organic or industrial contaminants, for example, such as these D naphthalene. And one of the implications of the regulation is the potential for conflicting land use. But the province has a process where you can apply for exemptions, and they'll generally work with an historical landowner to either phase in improvements, such as move petroleum storage tanks out of the Zone B into the Zone C, and thereby ultimately get the well field protected and the main contaminant sources away from the wells. Here's an example of the well field protection zones. This is the town of Shediac. We can see their main production wells here going from west to east, and the red being Zone A, the green being Zone B, and the purple or blue being Zone C. So these are developed using groundwater numerical modeling techniques. Another initiative, which ultimately I think came out of the Walkerton situation, was groundwater under the direct influence of surface water. And basically what that refers to is for groundwater that can be impacted by near surface or surface phenomenon, such as rainfall events or fractures that are linked to the surface. And again, that means that the well will be have more potential to be contaminated. So the province has implemented a gooding screening protocol. And if there is potential, or if it's proven that the well is subject to goody, then mitigation measures can include upgrading the water treatment plant to provide additional treatment steps. I just want to talk briefly or provide an example of how we pull all these things together in New Brunswick, or an example of what we've done. This had been an initiative undertaken by the Royal District Planning Commission, which oversaw the Sussex region from Sussex down to St. Martin's. Fairly large area. So it's an example of that planning district taking a proactive approach to develop a tool to help manage development within the region. So we completed this, can't remember what it was, I can't quite see the date there. It was roughly 10, 15 years ago. We took the approach recommended by the expert panel on groundwater for Canada, where you collect all your database elements, you put together the geological framework, you define your different hydrogeological regimes or districts. You do a quantitative or conceptual model to identify the relative aquifer vulnerability in the area, and that can ultimately be used as a decision-making tool to help in land use planning or water resource allocations. How do we do this? We take the basic bedrock geology maps and the superficial geology maps. And again, the New Brunswick Department of Natural Resources has world-class expertise in mapping. Province is very well understood geologically. We, as hydrogeologists, we combine these into the different hydrostratigraphic units, which control the occurrence and flow of groundwater. And then we take these different hydrostratigraphic units and put them together into these block models, such as we see here. Now, for this study, we were looking at, again, what we would consider the main potable water, groundwater resource, the upper 1 to 200 meters. We're not necessarily looking at deep potential sources of contamination, which might be oil and gas exploration, very little in this region, although when this was being looked at by the Planning Commission, this was one of the areas where shale gas exploration was being focused. Mining activity is another potential source, and saltwater intrusion. So how did we do it? We took what they call the drastic model, which stands for we take the depth to water table, we take the recharge amounts, we look at the aquifer media, we look at the soil media, the topography, the unsaturated zone media, and the hydraulic conductivity of the aquifer. And that basically defines the drastic approach, a very high level approach to look at potential for aquifer contamination or vulnerability. And we looked, again, mainly at recharge areas. So when we did this exercise, we determined a range these are relative rankings, a low of 65, which would be relatively low vulnerability, to a high of 223, which would be a relatively sensitive or vulnerable area. And we put all these together into a map, and here we show the different regions or units, types of units, which we differentiated. We can see the extensive faulting in red here, which are obviously one of the higher or the more vulnerable areas for contamination. And then the other rankings based on geology and hydrologic setting. So again, this was developed or intended as one tool to be used by the Planning Commission to help manage development. It doesn't necessarily say that no, a certain development can't go in a certain area. It's just, it was intended to serve as just an additional tool when they considered developments in the area. So that's about it. I think hopefully I gave a good overview of hydrogeology and I guess from a regional perspective and how it might be used. Any questions?
Thank you, John.
For time?
Yeah, before we get to questions, I encourage everyone to unmute themselves and give John a clap so he can hear it. Thank you, everyone, for indulging me in that.
Very good.
Okay, we have a couple questions. First from Julie. Julie asks, is there a way for a homeowner to measure how fast their private well is being naturally recharged?
There is a way you could, and typically, actually, we're just finishing up a pump test today, but that would be more for a municipality, and it's a requirement by the province when you develop a high capacity well, because it may impact other homeowners in the area which are on private wells. Typically, a private well owner, they could do it. If they can access their well, they can turn it on, pump it down for a half hour and see how it recovers. Just get a general feel for it. But for a residential well, you don't need that much water, because you not only have the aquifer that you're tapping, and that can be either very good or it can be very poor. But for a typical residential well, you don't need a lot of water. You know, a 2 gallon a minute well would serve a residence quite nicely, because in addition to what comes in from the formation, overnight your casing is going to fill up, and that provides storage, for lack of a better word. So, you know, in the morning, what we'll see is that may be pumped down to the pump level or close to it. But over the day, you know, once you have had your shower and washed your dishes, it'll recharge overnight. So typically you wouldn't have to do that. And if you look in general terms at the, you know, the geology around you and other well yields, and the province has a well log database that you can look at. You can't look at individual homeowners due to privacy information, but you can look at yields around your area. You can draw a sort of a circle and it'll come up with, you know, range of well yields. So unless a person's really having a problem, you wouldn't do that. And there are people who do have that problem where their wells will go dry. They might only have a quarter of a gallon a minute or a half a gallon. And Memram Cook would be one of those areas, for instance. Or Salisbury, as we saw, very poor aquifer potential and quite variable.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions from Arthur. The first is, how deep is the shallow water and the 100-year-old water?
Again, that would depend on where you are and where you are in the recharge discharge areas, what the type of geology is. Again, relatively speaking, say in Prince Edward Island, you have fairly permeable overburden. And it would be in the literature for various areas of the province. I think you could find it for certain areas. I think in particular, Prince Edward Island. There's various tools you can use to date it, such as isotopes. We've done a little bit of that work with tritium and other naturally occurring isotopes. But again, I mean, say in the upper, in the bottom part of that 100 or 200 meter zone, I'm pulling numbers out of the air, but I think we'd be into the 100 or hundreds of years. In the shallower, upper 10 meters, let's say, we might, well, at the top, obviously, we might be into, the most recent year of recharge and going, say, up to 3, 4, 5 years from, in the upper 10 meters. So really, it would be hard to say. But that being said, you could probably figure it out, but it's relatively expensive to do some of these isotope analyses.
Right. And then one more question from Arthur. How deep could a well be before it gets spoiled by picking up salt water if you are in a coastal community?
Again, that can vary quite a bit.
What about for Shediac then? Because I think a lot of us are located in Shediac in this
Well,
webinar.
for Shediac, the wells down there would be on the order of 300 meters. Those would be the town's municipal production wells. We generally would not want to go much deeper than that. Not to say that we couldn't, because what also happens along the coastline of New Brunswick is we have interlayering of sandstone units and siltstone units. And so the salt water can, like right next to the beach, as it were, if you drilled down to the unconfined aquifer, say with a 30-foot well, you might hit salt water. Whereas if you drilled deeper down, you might hit fresh water, because what's happened is you've hit a lens where the fresh water from further inland has sufficient pressure to push the salt water out. And there was a fairly classic study done during the 70s around Shediac with some nice images that kind of show that pictorially, how you can get these different saltwater lenses depending on the layering of the strata. So, in Shediac, I would think you could drill a 60-foot well and have a pretty good potential of getting good yield from it. Now, the water well regulation that the province has put in requires that your minimum casing depth, that steel casing, be about 20 meters. And that's to protect from near surface sources such as leak, inadequate septic systems that your neighbors might have. And we all know that there's a number of older cottages and around this region, as in many regions of the Maritimes, as well. There's potential for older service lines, to sewer lines to leak. So.
Okay, thanks, John. There's a couple more questions in the chat, but I encourage everyone to save those for the breakout rooms. And also, if there's any specific topics that came up during John's presentation that you want to discuss more of, you can put it in the chat as a discussion room topic, and we'll make that for you so you can get into that discussion around 3:30. Thank you again to John. That was fantastic. Thank you for opening up our webinar. Next, we'll move on to Rosemary. Julie, do you want to take it away?
Oui. Donc, c'est ça. La prochaine présentation est avec Rosemary Lonis. Donc, Rosemary est la présidente et la directrice générale du groupe Helping Nature Heal.
She's the general director. The ecological is in Nova Scotia since 2021. She is responsible for that. Rosemary has followed different training in Canada as well as the United States and created her own unique method adapted to the climate of Atlantic Canada. She teaches her method to the owner and special project people since 2019 in Shore how to make sure to heal. We had the opportunity of having it Rosemary with her, so her presentation today is entitled From Roots, from Water to Roots. So it bears on the way the reconstruction, how it avoids the betterment in the water system. She explains also how the plants absorb water and avoid toxin of entering the water source. I introduce Rosemary on this. Hello.
All right, let's see here now. Just get this one going. Current slide. There we go. Okay, well, thanks so much for that introduction, Julie. And I'll just make sure that everyone can see me okay. Can you just give me a heads up maybe or something? I don't see.
We can see you.
Everything's good and you
We
can see my,
can't,
all right.
we can't see your presentation though.
Oh, you can't see it. Okay, 1 second here. Let's go back. All right, just have my tech person here help me out. There we go. Always fun to be in presentation mode with everyone and all the technology that goes on with that.
Yes.
So are you okay there now? Can you see our front cover?
We see it now, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, I just want to thank John so much for opening up with all this beautiful groundwater information. I learned quite a bit there on your presentation. So thanks for that, John. And thanks to the organizing committee for having me here. And we'll move through my slides and feel free again to ask questions and we'll make the adjustments to the chat here as we can. So we've been working in the Maritime since 2001, and we've won a few awards. And our most recent one was for a project that we did in Cocagne with Julie and some of the other organizations here, building a coastal park for Cocagne Marina, and super excited that the Greener Green Spaces organization has taken witness to that, and always nice to have some awards and things to share with other people and other groups. Okay, so this is the water cycle as we know it. John had a similar picture of this. And of course, I think we're all sort of remembering about that now, especially as we have these really extreme winter storms that are causing erosion and overland flow and various runoff challenges, that all of that is coming from this evaporation and coming back down through the cycle through precipitation. And of course that comes in rain and snow. And so here on the South Shore, we've had a lot of rainstorms this winter, and currently everything is covered in a coat of ice, and you know, we wonder like what's happening with that. And it's reasonable to understand that this is confusing to some people, but also to remember that we learned about this stuff in grade school and middle school, that this water cycle is ever present, and really making use of that humidity that we experienced last summer. If you remember, we had some 40-degree days here in the Maritimes with high humidity levels. All of that water that evaporated, and you know, we could feel the stickiness on us, got up into the atmosphere, and when it cooled down, of course, it falls down again as precipitation. So a great thing to remember is that our plants can help buffer that whole process, and it can really help to take up water from the ground level, from the surface, reuse it within their bodies and their cell structure. So there's not as much going up into the air. Obviously, the plants do perspire. They have this evapotranspiration that happens, but it is much lessened when we have a great colony of plants to make use of that water rather than just evaporation off of open ground. So my talk is really about how do the plants help with this water situation that we find ourselves in. Of course, the storage of water below ground, like John was talking about, is assisted with the plants because their root systems, drive deep into the soil and help to keep the water in the ground. And as the water is coming through the sky and landing on our branches and trees and bushes and things, it's more gently falling into the water and the ground zone. It's not driving deep into the water, into the ground like a drill going down into the soil. So it can help buffer how much water is moving in through all of our different cycles. So it's great to kind of keep our memories about these things and to relearn and re-engage with how the water is actually moving through the system and what we can do about it to prevent these catastrophic flooding, and overflowing our storm sewers and things like that. All right, so this riparian zone is a really important space. It's that space between the dry upland and the wet, maybe it's the ocean front or lake or river front, depending on what your situation is. And that we call it sometimes the ribbon of life. It's this really diverse zone where we have plants from the upland merging with the plants from the shoreline. Those two ecosystems are kind of blending together in the riparian zone, making it very abundant, really have a lot of different species in it, different animals, as well as a wide berth of plants. And we love this. We love that idea of biodiversity, of having all sorts of plants and critters living in this area. Of course, they all use up water as well and take up space and deflect water. And so they really do help to kind of temper the volatility of the rain landing on us. We know that rain drops at, I think it's around 25 miles per hour from the sky. So it's landing on the ground with quite a velocity. And if we don't have plants there to kind of buffer that, then it's drilling into the soil and expressing, eroding the soils and the sediments. And then eventually we get, clumps being torn off and sloughed off of our edges. And of course, overland flow is a major contributor to shoreline erosion. About 40% of erosion is contributed to by our overland flow. So if we can slow that down in the upland, then we're well on our way to making ground more strategic work on the shoreline and really saving our coastline. We can look here at some unhealthy riparian zones. Of course, the one on the left, we would very much agree that this is an unhealthy space, that the land is being gouged away and pulled away from its upland. And you'll notice that it's been maybe mowed or a farm field that's been hayed above that. Further down that same creek, we can see the forest right at the water's edge. And we notice that there's not much erosion down there. Even on the other side of the river, we have evergreens right close to the water's edge and shrubs that are leaning in and branches leaning over top of the water. So this picture alone helps to kind of prove our point that ecosystem at the water's edge in that riparian zone, having that can really help us to slow down the rate of erosion and really hold our banks and slopes in place. Of course, that's happening because of our root systems and the deflective mechanisms that I just talked about of the plants within the system. On the top right-hand side here of the slide, we see that someone has put in a rock wall. Now, this may be one of the better rock walls that I've seen where it's on a slope. It's not too vertical, that it won't create a big wall of activity, of deflection of energy and whatnot. but it's still unhealthy in that it doesn't include the plant community. The animals are not there either, and they don't have place to create habitat and shelter, place to raise their young, find food sources and all the things that they require for a healthy living. So even though it feels like that might be more stable environment with all that rock there, it's still really contributing to the unhealth or the dis-ease of this place. And those little tiny plants at the top of the rock wall are not going to do much to help knit that space together when we do have storm surge or overland flow occurring in that zone. The other thing I notice here is that they have piping going right into the water. You can see that little shed in the foreground or the background of this page, and it looks like they have water pipes, maybe from basement drainage or eaves trough flowing across the rock wall and landing into the beach zone. That will also contribute to erosion and the lack of plant diversity in that system, in that little ecosystem. So I would really point that out, because a lot of people do send their water back out into the waterway, either the ocean or the lake or the river that they're living on. And it really does contribute to a kind of a speedy way of getting any toxins or any effluent out of your landscape into the waterway, which we definitely don't want to have happen. We want to try and keep our waterways as pristine and clean as possible. All right, so here's a sampling of a schematic that we have put together in our company here, and it helps us to understand the impact of having not very much vegetation on the slope, or whether that's a lake or a river or stream, it all sort of works the same, whether that's the ocean front. When we don't have a whole lot of plant life there in that ribbon of life, that riparian zone, you can see in the top kind of right-hand side of that schematic that there's splash over and that the water is drilling down into that landscape. And without a whole lot of roots, we have displacement of rocks and boulders. And as the water gets into these big crevasses, then being that we're in North America, we go through the freeze-thaw cycles. And so when water freezes, it expands, of course. And so it makes these crevasses even bigger. And then over time, we can actually lose chunks of land over the edge. And those little plants that are there are not going to do much effort into actually holding that zone together. So chunks of this edge are going to slough off. Rainflow, as I mentioned earlier, is really comes down at a high velocity. So if there's nothing to buffer that rainflow, then it just washes across and takes sediment and materials, leaf litter, small stems and branches and things, garbage, plastic, all of that gets washed right down into the waterway and contributes to all of our other kind of littery kind of challenges. We notice also that the evaporation rate is about 30% when we lack a connective canopy. So when there's gaps in the canopy, the evaporation is quite extensive and high, and it's coming right off the ground level. And the rate of runoff is about 55% when we have lack of canopy cover, which also means that our infiltration rate, which John was talking a lot about, the rate that the water actually gets back into the soil horizon is really quite small, very minimal at 15%. So mowing the upland is really quite challenging for a complete ecosystem. So we often will encourage people to stop mowing some distance back from the edge, even if it's only a few more mower widths wide to start, and then eventually getting that bigger and bigger with more diverse plant material within it. And I'll be talking about plant recipes and stuff in the coming slides. Okay, so we can kind of see this as a wounded ecosystem that's missing a whole bunch of its parts. And so we're going to look at what occurs when that happens. We get algae blooms, of course, pollution enters the waterway. Whoops, sorry. We get accelerated erosion, freeze-thaw cycles are increased, of course. And then this alteration, because of all those things, the plant and animal species that are supposed to live in our waterways, of course, have more challenge too. So we end up with having large kill zones or dead zones in the water where the animals can't live there anymore because of all of these overland issues that we've created. Okay, so here is a healthy ecosystem. We know it's healthy because it has all the different components of an ecosystem. It has canopy trees, small trees, large shrubs, smaller shrubs, seedling trees. There's a grassy layer, there's perennials, and certainly there is mowed pathways. There's room for this. There's room for us humans within the landscape, right? We want to remember that we live here too, and that, we have a right to take part and experience nature in its fullest, and that means in the riparian zone as well. So we encourage people to have mowed pathways that are maybe 3 feet wide, maybe 4 feet if you have children or pets that you might be carrying around with you or walking with hand in hand, but to make them as minimal as you can, and to frame them with a really beautiful pollinator meadow that includes all of our, native perennials and grasses, and a few ornamentals in there for pops of color or maintaining, interest and diversity throughout the entire year. It's really lovely to have that meadow on either side of a perennial meadow, on either side of pathways. It just makes it more interesting to walk through that space. Another option might be pea gravels or wood chip fiber, could be mulch, could be, trees that get blown over in the wintertime with our big storms. You could rent a chipper and chip those up and make these pathways that are more absorbent and less compacting. When we have just grass, as we walk on it, of course, and as we mow with our lawnmower, we're compacting that zone quite a bit. And because lawn grasses don't have really deep root systems, then we can get into some trouble with the heavy storm rains that we're having lately, that this rain can actually drill into the lawn and create some sinkholes and displace some sediments as well. So when we add fibers or loose gravels to pathways, we're kind of floating on top of the soil horizon. If there's wood chips or pea gravels and things, we're floating on top. So we're not really compacting at the same rate as if we're walking just on grass. So it might be an idea to think about some alternative flooring for your pathways if you can. Beyond the perennial meadow, we stretch into the grasses and the small shrubs. The one that is depicted here is sweet fern. It's one of my favorites. We use the sweet fern shrub because it has a runner root that gets all tangled up amongst all the other root systems of the plants. And it really does help to sort of knit that top soil horizon together and make it more strong. So when the rains are pummeling down, the water is displaced by the above ground parts of the plants, but also as it leaches into the ground, it's not as damaging as if there's no plants there at all. So that's a really great one. And of course, we have a ton of native shrubs that could provide food and pollination and great things for the critters that want to live in this ecosystem. When we get into the grasses, of course, we have a whole host of native grasses, but we can also look to our farmers co-op to purchase seed that might be used in the farm fields in our neighborhoods. So it might be nice to look around at the farm fields and see, what are the farmers planting here? The reason I bring that up is that if we can engage those same species in a new environment, the bees and bugs that live over in the farm fields, we give them a new diverse place to come and get pollen. So then if we're getting honey from them, we have a diversity of flavors going in, but it gives them some diversity of food sources and maybe fodder for building nesting or cavities for raising their young and, having their babies in there. So they can come over to your land, grab some beautiful seed heads and some fluff from the grasses and take that back into their nesting area and create a really great home for their babies. Then, of course, here we have these big canopy trees that have really deep and wide branching root systems that go deep and wide. And so these are sort of our anchor plants. They really help hold in our soils. And if we have bedrock near the surface of our land, these roots are tenacious enough to kind of work their way around those boulders and really nuzzle into the deeper landscape. And that's great because when we have the storms, we want them to be deeply anchored and able to withstand the wind and rain pressures of the shoreline. But even if you're in an upland, in a dry version, in an urban kind of setting or a subdivision in the upland, these big trees provide shade. They provide, space to hang a swing for your children or the grandchildren, nesting areas for the bigger predators, things like ospreys and owls and falcons and hawks will take refuge in these bigger canopy trees. So it's really nice to have space for them to hang out. The canopies are also really big and wide and usually fairly dense. So they create a shade space around them and underneath them, like a column of shade. The benefit of that is that we have a different species of plants that likes to live in the shady zones. So out in the, in the open sun area in the upland, we have all these great blooming flowers and things. But in the shade zones, we have a very unique set of plants that like to live in there. Could be ferns or shade tolerant perennials like hellebores. Could be things that are mushrooms and lichens and things like that that really like that deep shade. The benefit of those big wide canopies, of course, as you can see, is that they deflect and dissipate the energy of the rain so that when it lands on the ground, it has way less velocity to it as it's found its way through the canopy and all the branches and made its way all the way down to the ground. It really has lessened that tenacity to drill into the soil horizon. So it makes for a much safer space to have these big canopy trees. Of course, underneath them, we have small trees, large shrubs, and depending on the gaps in the canopy, how much light is filtering down through will really determine what type of plants and how many are underneath that canopy. As we move down the slope, this could be, the ditch in your front yard. If you live on an urban streetscape where there's ditches and culverts and things, you don't want your land all sloughing off into that ditch. And then the town has to come and dig it out and create pathways for the water to really move through your community. So it's equally as important, regardless if you're an urban, rural space, if you're on the shoreline, on the coast of the ocean or a lake or a river stream. These are really valuable ideas for you to integrate into your own landscape. And of course, we can see there's almost always a grassy layer, sometimes a perennial layer too, with things like irises and marsh marigolds, other kind of marshy type plants living at the edge where the water does have a relationship with the dry soil. And that water moves in underneath the ground a little bit. So there's this watery way, sometimes we have very specific plants right at that interzone where the water and the land meet. Sometimes we have the plant known as Hackmatack or tamarack. They really love, it's our semi-evergreen tree. They really love having wet feet. So do some of the roses and some of the shrubs like alders and bayberry. They really don't mind having their root systems, their feet, in those watery soils. And so it's great to have that diversity right down to the water like we saw in that very first picture. And then, of course, we see that the evaporation rate is 40% here. The infiltration rate is 50% when we have a fully functioning ecosystem. And that's really fantastic. If we can slow 50% of the water from rushing off of our soils and our land, then, we're halfway there to slowing down this whole erosion challenge that we have. And of course, the runoff is minuscule, right? 10% compared to what we had before. So it's really, really important that we think about this dynamic, interesting, diverse place and really engage with as many plants as possible and try to develop them in as many locations as we can, whether it's a home or a park or any other space that we can help with the revegetation. We talk sometimes about the ecosystem triangle, and that is a kind of a design detail that we think about, but it's also this kind of really great way of mimicking our natural Acadian forest ecosystem that we live in. And so if we can think about these trees as being the, kind of climax plant of our ecosystem, they're tall, they make the big end, the tall end of our triangle. And then as you can see, it goes down as a right angle triangle to the ground. So from the biggest plants all the way down to the smaller plants. And when we mix up our combinations of these plants and, experiment a little or try to see if a plant will live under a shade canopy, or maybe it has to be just under the drip line to get enough light. When we play here and we recreate these spaces, we're really generating life for ourselves. We're generating oxygen and holding these soils in so we can grow food and things. Also, the critters are benefiting, of course, because they get all these multiple places to live in. And what's really interesting is what's going on below ground. So you can see the diversity of root systems that are engaged when we have a diverse above ground portion, right? We think about our ecosystems, we see them visually, and we're always thinking about what we notice, what we see above ground, but equally as important is what's going on below ground. And so this schematic really helps us to kind of connect with that idea that plants have different types of roots. They absorb different amounts of water underneath the ground. They bind to the soil to help hold the soil together. They also bind to each other and they become friends and relatives with each other, help each other out, share food and water and information. And so the greater diversity then, just like our human communities, the richer, the more robust our life can be, right? These plants are no longer living in silos all by themselves with mowed grass all around them. I often think how lonely they must be. You see these kind of popsicle stick trees with just a big lawn around them. And I wonder if they're missing all their relatives and all their buddies in the ecosystem. So this way, this kind of thinking is a bit of a paradigm shift from a traditional landscaping point of view, where we're trying to control and keep everything isolated. And rather, the ecosystem style lets us engage in that diversity, encourages us to let plants grow to fruition, let them go flower, let them go to seed, let the birds eat from them, let the birds poop around our landscape and spread those flowers around. It really makes for a much more random and diverse landscape plan, especially if we have meadows and things where the birds are actually doing the gardening for us. So that's really kind of fun. In this schematic, we see things like from the ground covers to short grasses, perennials, tall grasses. Just notice for a minute the root systems on those perennials and grasses. Imagine if we could engage those and empower them to really grow to their fruition and really fulfill their life's destiny, how much effort they could put together for us. They would be able to slow down erosion in no time. And this is really part of the premise of building the ecosystem, is so that the plants can actually help us live here and continue to live here on this planet, right? We need the plants. They're really the whole base of our life needs, right? They produce oxygen, they hold the soil together, they create food and generate clean air for us to breathe. Everything flows through the soil system, whether it's the carbon cycle, the water cycle, all of our cycles, nutrients, phosphorus, etc. They all pass through that soil system at some point. And keeping soils healthy means that we need to have diverse root systems in there, shedding their cells in the dormant season, breaking off or dying if they're annuals, decomposing under there, feeding the soil biology and all of those nematodes and protozoas and bacteria and fungi that live underneath there. That's where the value comes, right? When we add fertilizers and things to our plants, it has to be digested or disseminated in some way in order for those root systems to actually be able to tuck them in, to be able to suck them up and make use of them in their plant bodies. So why not let the bugs do that? Why not let the critters do it? You know, if they're eating plant litter and leaf litter and bringing that nourishment down into the soil horizon, these roots will be stronger and healthier and be able to hold on longer and hang on to each other. And just like we said earlier about if there's boulders and bedrock underneath your soils, they can wiggle their roots down and have the tenacity to make their way in through all of that rock and chunky, you know, even compacted soils in order to hold on and really hang on to the earth when those storms come and blow around. So plants are extremely helpful, obviously, right? It's super important to remember that they're actually partners here on this planet with us, and they really do help us out. So we want to keep adding them to our landscape, adding more diversity to the landscape. Of course, we want to think of native plants first that are supposed to live here in the ecosystem with us, but we also have a whole collection of plants that we call heritage species. And those are the plants that have come with us as we've immigrated here, as we've come to live in these places. We've brought plants with us through our ancestry. And so it's good to kind of acknowledge those and make use of some of those as well. Some of them that I can think of are Forsythia, which is one of the first bloomers in the spring. After this long, hard, cold winter, we get to see these beautiful yellow flowers shooting out at us. They're some of the first blossoms for the bees and the early bugs that come out of dormancy. And so, you know, they have a place. We don't want to take over our native species, of course, but it's important to realize that we have other plant choices as well, and maybe use a few of those strategically in our landscape. The main portion of this photo is that we want to really engage you and look at what are the depths of the different root systems and what are the strengths of those root systems. So when I look here, I can see that, you know, some of these, oh, here's a really good one. We use this one often, Liatris, sometimes called blazing star. Look at that root system, almost 14 feet underground. That's incredible for a little tiny plant. You know, you see it, it might be 12 inches high in the landscape, and yet the root systems are going 14 feet down. That's incredible. We have Echinacea right there beside it, and that's looking at maybe 4 or 5 feet in depth, and then some grasses, big blue stem, down another 9 feet, prairie cordgrass or spartinas, which we use a ton of, down 10 feet. And here we have some other grasses, 14, 15 feet. Notice how some of them are wider and have more density to them. Some of them are long and stringy like spaghetti. Some are wide spreading and move by root zones, by rhizomes as they grow sideways and clumping patterns. And then in the middle, Kentucky bluegrass, not even a foot deep. How can we expect that to do any work, right? I mean, holy smokes, we need way more diversity than that if we're thinking about using these plants in a helpful way, to, especially if we're trying to slow down erosion. The grasses also, because they are so broad and diverse and tall and wide spreading, they too prevent evaporation, right? Because they create shade. They also blow in the wind, so the wind isn't hitting the soil surface exactly on target. It's hitting the plants first, and then the plants are wiggling and jiggling and actually invigorating more root systems to grow through that activity. When we look at the lawn, that Kentucky bluegrass, you can imagine the evaporation that's happening off of that, right? Especially if we're cutting it every 7 days, like most of us do. So it's really, really beneficial. I would encourage you to take a screenshot of this and stick that on your fridge the next time someone says, hey, how come you're not mowing your lawn? You're letting that all grow crazy. Are you lazy? What's happening over here, right? You can say, oh, I'm helping the soil to stay moist and healthy, and I'm encouraging the soil food web to be active and healthy and produce great plants for me, and maybe even some food for us. So that'll be a good rebuttal when your neighbor says, hey, how come you're not mowing your lawn? You can take that into account. The other thing that's pretty important, I would say, especially if you're thinking about erosion issues, is the tensile strength of these systems. These root systems have strength. If any of you have ever tried to move a really big shrub or eliminate goutweed or any other kind of invasive weed out of your garden, you know that roots are really strong, right? You got to dig them and fork them and drag them. And sometimes we even see our neighbors pulling a shrub out with a truck or a big backhoe or something like that. These roots are embedded in the land. They're holding on for dear life. If we remember that they're living, breathing creatures, just like me and you, they have this kind of genetic goal to live out their life and produce seed and rootlings so that they will, guarantee their life will carry on. And all of that hope and ingenuity that these plants have within them is also holding them into the ground. That strength of holding in, we call tensile strength. We think of tensile strength sometimes when we buy rope or wire. How strong is this wire? Is that going to be able to pull my truck out of the ditch? We need a different grade of rope or wire to be able to do that. That's the tensile strength of that commodity. Well, root systems have tensile strength too. And look at these. These are newtons. These are like 160 newtons. That is a ton of strength. And I should have had some comparisons to some kind of like tie down straps or bungee cords or something. I'll add that on the next time we do this slide. And I'll find that out. If anyone's wondering what those strengths are from other things that we use in our world, when we tie things to the back of our trailer, what's the strength of that strap? I'm going to figure that out and compare it here. But imagine if we can think of these plants as having this above ground capacity, the root system below ground, and strength, right? That they have this tensile strength. That'd be really incredible. It gives us a whole new interest in the plants, gives us a whole new way of seeing them as partners on this planet, helping us to hold this whole thing together. And we can really dive into some good math there, figuring out the plant recipes. We're going to talk about that next. If you know our work, we've done a whole bunch of living shoreline projects in the last 20 years. And this big shot is a project that we've been working on for about 5 years. You can see where the property line is. It's pretty obvious. One neighbor is doing the living shoreline project and the other neighbor is not, right? And luckily, this home has recently been sold and the new owners are interested in carrying the work along on their shoreline as well. We can see the effects of erosion here pretty easily. From the crest, we can see that big shade, that dark layer right underneath the crest. That crest is about 4 feet deep. So when the guy is mowing, I'm like, get back, because he could just fall right over the edge. That crest could just break off really quickly and easily and go tumbling down the slope. On the left-hand side of this property line is the work of Helping Nature Heal. And you can see that it blends into the upland pretty well. There's all kinds of plants growing there. We have a big colony of willow as well as grasses growing within the cobble at the base of that slope. And then you can see the gray branches. That is a new section that had been eroded in a really big storm. I believe it was Dorian that came along and kind of chewed that piece out. It didn't chew out our willows though, you notice they're still growing as well as they ever were. But that section right beside the non-living shoreline zone is quite fragile. And as the energy moves through that system, there's a splashover that happens. And so those gray branches that were newly placed there are underneath them is hay and plants, and we've stuck live stakes all through that to help hold it in place until the willow can start to grow again and the grasses can take hold. So these plants are a really great demonstration of tensile strength, right? Of tenacity, of their capacity to withstand the pressures of storms, to really be able to hold themselves in. And even when a storm like Dorian makes damage and causes change, it's pretty easy to fix it afterwards. Now, I'm not here to promote the Living Shoreline program, but I think it's pretty simple to see that right there. What we're really talking about is these plants' capacity to buffer what is happening from the environmental pressures. And so on the right-hand side, you can see that where there's no plants, we see erosion happening. There's what we call rills and gullies, those little lines that you see traveling vertically down the slope. That's where water's dripping from the above the crest. That crest, all that vegetation and root zone on the crest, it acts like a big sponge. It's holding the water and then it's dripping down. And so as every water drip falls on that open sediment, it's taking land with it. And sooner or later, a big chunk was going to come off. And so on the left, we can see that that dripping doesn't occur. We've kind of sealed up the wound, and we're actually using the overland flow to feed the plants that are thriving in that landscape now. So the right plant in the right place makes a ton of benefit and a ton of difference to the outcome of our water and overland flow and how our plants can actually help us. On the lower right-hand side, we see a smaller photograph there of a meadow that is above a shoreline. You can see there's a rock wall down there at the bottom, and then that entire slope has been replanted, and those plants are helping to hold that soil horizon together and doing really good work at preventing overland flow, and so that we're not losing the edge anymore. That's a really great comparison and a really good thing to think about when you're choosing whether or not to cut down your trees and develop your land or mow your frontage right to the edge. Try to think about these ideas, and I hope they kind of stick in your mindset, and that you think twice about doing some of those activities. So we wanted to look at some plant recipes, and I wanted to just highlight some of the plants that we typically use along the coast or in any landscape if we're concerned about water quality, water movement, how it's picking up sediment and toxins and things from the upland and moving through the space. So this is the red oak. It's one of our native species. It likes living on the coastline. It's native to here. And let's see, these root systems extend 3 to 6 feet away from the center of the trunk. So there's a root system going wide around the trunk and then can extend 50 feet. We can go, I've seen big, huge maples with a 50-foot wide root ball. Right? And when that tree flips over in a big aggressive storm, typically because it's been mowed around or it's in an urban situation where there's pavement and sidewalks that have harmed or severed its root system, these root systems are pretty fantastic to see. And getting to see the underneath of a root system is really wild as well. So we can see that the peripheral roots, 50 feet wide, 3 to 6 feet deep. I've seen that in both directions, depending on the soil horizon and what is deeper down. You know, if it can't get all the way down, it's going to go wider. Plants don't really grow in those round or square pots that we buy them from at the nursery. You know, they don't care what shape their root ball is in. They can even grow in very narrow soils. They just will be wide, right? There's a critical volume of soil that the plant needs in order to feed itself, gain water from it, and really hang on and live through its full life cycle. So whether that's deep and narrow, or thin and wide, or somewhere in between, if we can provide these spaces for the plants, then they'll be able to come to fruition and really, provide all this extra effort for us. The next one that I love using, one of our native roses, it's a coastal plant and it's Rosa virginiana. And boy, she is a tough worker, I tell you. She blooms great all summer, you know, from June in through the frost usually. And these big hips that come along, we can be using those for teas and tinctures, and high in vitamin C, really vital for us to be consuming. But imagine our critters that live in the land amongst us, right? How much nourishment they're getting from these plants, let alone the pollen and all of the juices that are coming out of those pores and stems. And this one is about 3 feet by 3 feet. And we typically use them in colonies so that they're knitted together from their buddies and their neighbors. The other great thing about the Rosa virginiana is that as those top layer scaffold root systems travel, they will pop up and create another plant. So you can buy one plant and in a couple of years, you have 3 or 4 feet of plants, right? They multiply exponentially once they get settled in. So that knitting together of the root system is really valuable. And they grow in all directions, not just in a single line, right? So you can really create a bit of a shrub layer and a edge of a meadow or a forest edge, even the coastline. We often plant Rosa virginiana amongst rock walls to help slow down that expression of water over the edge. Grains and grasses, of course, are some of my favorites. Some of the grasses that we use can go down as deep as 20 feet. Here we're saying 6 to 10 feet as kind of a safe average, but there's definitely grasses that go really deep down. And so connected with the roses and the trees, you can start to formulate these plant recipes specific to soil types, environmental exposure, typical rain loads in your area. You can take all of those environmental issues and create a plant recipe that's going to help that landscape to really stay connected and stay solid and slow down erosional processes, but not just the erosion, all the impact that the overland flow and development and mowing and all of these things that we do in our human world, let alone the big picture of climate change. We can really be effective when we think about these plants. So think about grains and grasses as a new buddy that you might add to your gardens, your meadows, and your coastal edges and within the riparian zones. There's also grains and grasses that can tolerate shade. So if you're converting a treed area to a more wild space, we often will spread seed, which encourages birds and squirrels and critters to move in and eat those seeds and then poop them out somewhere else. So we get this extra effort by the animals that live in our area. And Comptonia, one of my favorites. The sweet fern is always such a lovely plant. It's very tolerant to almost all of the ecosystems that we live in, the eco districts, the eco zones within the maritime provinces. It grows in colonies. Its root system is horizontal. It's typically only 4 to 6 inches deep in the soil, and it really likes kind of wounded soils or soils beside roads or pathways. Compaction doesn't bother it too much. Because it's traveling in just that top layer, it can really find its way amongst rocks and barriers. And I've seen it go underneath patio stones and then pop up in the cracks. It's a real opportunist, and it's a hard worker, I would say equal to the Rosa virginiana. And because of that habit of narrow root system, it can pop up and stimulate a new plant almost anywhere. So you can get a really nice dense canopy pretty quickly by planting the sweet fern. And because it likes kind of nasty soil, it's a good one for almost any project. The other great thing about this plant is that it's known as a pioneer plant. It comes in through this successional pathway shortly after the grains and perennials are fulfilling their life destiny. So as those grains and grasses and perennials are going to seed and maybe some are dying out, the sweet fern sends up or Comptonia, its common name is sweet fern, I should have added that. It comes up in those gaps and colonizes really quickly. So it can cover open soil, even through, you know, if we're just seeding in and then walking away from a space and not really maintaining or tending to a landscape, this plant works really good. And because it has all of that brilliant leaf structure, you see how so many leaves per stem, it can really deflect the rain and snow from it and help really reduce that energy that's coming into our landscapes. So that's really a vital, vital plant. And of course, fixing nitrogen so that other plants can take it up is a great benefit. Things like alders and lupins often do that, or do that, and get the nitrogen from the soil and the air and bring it into a plant available commodity so that your other plants are also benefiting from this plant. Sometimes we have get called in that, you know, our plants are looking a little sick or something. And so planting these beneficial plants around them and within them can really help. And you don't have to be adding fertilizers or anything like that. So here's a beautiful meadow that we planted over at Ocean Surf at the campground there that's just outside of Shediac. So if you're in the area, I'd really encourage you to go in and have a good look at this space. This used to have a trailer on it. It was hard, compacted, clayey soils. It had a lot of gravel on it. And we built a few berms along there's a rock wall as well that you can't see between the water and this plantation. And so we added some soils from a local area, and we added seed. We planted immature, mature, and full-grown plants within there. There are some little trees and shrubs in there as well, roses and dogwoods and some willows. And of course, we see the grains and grasses and a whole host of variety of perennials. This is one of my favorite plant recipes for the coastline, and I would really encourage you to jot down those plants and see where you can plant those in your landscape. This community of plants will reduce your overland flow rate by, you know, a ton. I would say less than 10% overland flow. So that means that we have about 90% infiltration rate when you plant this community. And then that means that we don't have toxins getting in there, that we don't have garbage, you know, decomposing and breaking apart and becoming microplastic and getting into that soil horizon. All right, so let's have another little look here. I know we have one of our presenters is looking at rain gardens, is going to give you a really great talk about rain gardens. But I just love this schematic, and I just wanted to highlight the idea that if you have water issues, if you're worried about groundwater, then absolutely one of the main things you can do is think about rain gardens, but also adding rain barrels, drainage pathways that kind of look like little creeks, and keeping that land as permeable as possible. So we slow down on our mowing, we allow plants to get to their full fruition, and we give them a chance to really get those root systems in deep, create all the leaf matter and their flowers and stems and things on the above ground parts, and really do their best at working for us. Not going to dive too deep into that because I know Jolene is our rain garden expert, and so she'll be up soon to talk about that specifically. Here is a rain garden that we planted in Cocagne, and I just wanted to look at it because it's part of the plant recipe idea. Iris, bayberry, alder, and willow. These plants work really good in conjunction together. They're part of a guild of watery plants that like to live together. That idea of guilds or companion plants is something I wanted to bring up as part of the plant recipe discussion. When we think about a guild, often I think about, a quilting guild or a quilting bee, a group of people who like to do the same activity, and they come together and they form a guild. And plants do the same kind of thing, right? There's specific plants that like to live together. In gardening world, we talk about companion plants. In biodynamics or permaculture, we have these notions that certain plants work together to create a better output, right? In permaculture, we think about food forests, where we might plant apple trees and roses and asparagus and edible vines and ferns, all in the same footprint. They work together to help each other have a better outcome. So the apples will taste better. The asparagus will have a greater flavor. Raspberries and roses and things will just really be able to be super healthy and be able to ward off pests and diseases and fungus that might blow in from the area around us. So this idea of plant recipes, they come together because of the soil first, and then because of the environmental impact. And so we can kind of catalog the plants in the idea of guilds, who likes to live together. And we can then think about what kind of soil do we have? Do we have wet, drenched soil like John was mentioning in the earlier presentation? Or does it filter through really quickly? Is it mostly sand, and so it doesn't hold water very much? What's the texture of the soil? What's the qualities of the soil? So when we think about the soil first, then we can find the plants that will love to live there, right? The right plant in the right place makes all the difference. And then when we think about the environmental exposure, whether we have storm surge and splash up of salty waters, of course, we're going to have a different type of plant that's going to love having salt on it than a plant that doesn't. So we investigate, we research, we think about these different qualities that the plants are going to need to live by. Then we think about who's using the space, who's the human in here, right? What's the greater purpose of the place? We bring our humanness into the ecosystem because we are part of nature. We are of it. And so we think about, how do we want to be in this place? Do we want to meander? Do we want to have place to sit and rest? Do we want to catalog the birds that are living near us? Are we a birder? Do we like to see that diversity in bird colonies? Are we really excited about pollinators? Do we want to observe butterflies in their full life cycles? Can we do that right there within our landscape? And the answer is yes, we can. We just have to take the time and the attention to actually pay attention, to take some notes, do a little research, and then think about, how do we want to be in there? We can wrap that all up in this plant recipe. And so when we're looking at various sites, we want to really, take a soil sample, test it, think about it more, think about how we want to experience the place. Maybe we have children or pets or relatives, neighbors that want to use the space as well. How is it going to appear to them? How do they, what's important to them? And can we bring that back into the design? And so this is all kinds of questions to be explored as we develop our plan to help our water quality and keep it healthy and clean and fresh so that we can use it for the next millennia, right? If we don't start taking care of these things and paying attention, we're going to start losing our capacity to live here on this planet. And climate change, of course, is ensuring that we better pay attention, right? Otherwise, it's not going to be too long before we're not going to be able to live here. So we want to take these opportunities to learn and grow and test and try some of this stuff out, even in our own backyard, so that we can stay here longer, right? Great. So when we think about water quality and these plants, there's this kind of crazy word called hyperaccumulator. And this is where the roots of the plants are capable of really ingesting high concentrations of really some nasty things in our world, right? Heavy metals, all kinds of toxins that might be spilled on our land or that are coming from, mining or quarrying or old dumps. We saw John's drawings with all of those kinds of horrible things that we do to ourselves in this land, and how they filter in through the soils. So we can start thinking about the plants as an ally to use up some of those things and hold them within their cell structure so that we are not exposed to them. Things like barley, right? Look at that, 1,000 milligrams of aluminum. That's pretty incredible, that the plant can actually store that quantity of aluminum in their plant structure. I mean, it's really amazing. And so we want to think about, what other plants like willow or dogwood, or are these, the bayberries and the things like that that we've mentioned previously. What other work can they do for us besides what we've already talked about, providing this above ground beauty and visual aesthetic, and helping our animals and critters live here longer? But what else can they do for us? So a little research can really drive us to thinking about, wow, how much of this CO2 are they holding? How much water do they take in? How much water do they hold throughout the course of a year? I think that lower thing, that 11,000 gallons of a 100-foot tall tree, right? That water is being cared for and held and then slowly released through their natural processes. It's really quite incredible. And if we can flip our paradigm by looking at these plants as allies to our lives here, wouldn't that be great, right? We can use these plants to help us stay here on this planet.
Hi, Rosemary. Oh, perfect. You're done. I was going to say we've got a bit over time. Finish, please.
Excellent. I'm so glad that worked out the way we wanted it to. Thank you. So thank you so much for paying attention and listening. And I see that there's lots going on in the chat there. So if there's time for questions, I'd love to get into that.
Thank you, Rosemary. Again, if everyone can unmute themselves and give Rosemary a round of applause, that would be great.
Information. That's great. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we'll have to move straight to the next presentation, but I've noted all of the questions, and there will be a breakout room on this topic. And so if you didn't get to ask your question, I encourage you to go to that breakout room and ask it there. But I did also write them down. So thank you again, Rosemary. Okay. Julie, if you'd like to introduce Brittany.
Yes, thank you so much, Rosemary. That was great. Donc, pour les deux prochaines présentations.
So for the next two presentations, as Clara mentioned at the beginning, we will wait till the end of the presentation, the two presentations, to answer questions, okay? The next presentation will be Brittany Cormier. Brittany works with the Alliance of the Petitcodiac Watershed as for the quality of water warden. For her presentation, she'll talk how to use the garden, the rain garden, which is to the climatic and the management of water rain. Brittany, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Julie, for that very kind introduction.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I am so happy to be here and learning from these incredible professionals. I have been taking so many notes. John and Rosemary, your presentations were absolutely captivating. I forgot that I was supposed to present next. So I'm just going to bring this up here. Here we go. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so my name is Brittany Cormier, and I will be discussing one of my favorite topics of all time, rain gardens. Also, Rosemary, I do know that Jolene is the expert on rain gardens, which is why I am so nervous to be going before her. So rain gardens, generally are an example of nature-based green infrastructure that is designed to capture stormwater runoff, usually from impervious surfaces that rain cannot penetrate and infiltrates through the soil. So impervious surfaces could be something such as roads, rooftops, or even parking lots. So rain gardens encourage the water, whether it's rainfall or snow melt, to travel into the ground instead of running over it towards streams or rivers, usually carrying hazardous pollutants. They work best with a biodiverse set of water-loving indigenous plants, if you can find them, or plant recipe as you have it. I actually use a lot of sweet fern and Virginia rose in my plant recipes for rain gardens as well, so it was really nice to see those featured. And if you can design your rain garden to bloom at interchangeable seasons, this is really great for pollinators too. And I mean, us as well. It's always nice to see a little pop of color all throughout the growing season. And instead of how gray infrastructure breaks down over time, green infrastructure like this will grow stronger over time with just a little bit of care. Here are a few of my favorite flowering species that are great for rain gardens. Nice little pop of color. And there are so many benefits to having a rain garden, so it was very hard to just choose these few. But they're excellent for stormwater management, flood mitigation, which is great for increasing the climate resiliency in communities and also in your backyard. Habitat connectivity can really help in urban areas where we've broken up a lot of the habitat corridors that pollinators or little critters would have before putting up houses or roads and what have you. So having little structures like these, rain gardens, can help bring a little bit of connection. So back, and depending on what flowering species you have, it can provide shelter and food. Yeah. And it also recharges groundwater by penetrating into the soil, and the root systems that grow in these gardens can really help discharge the water at a slower rate as well. And they do improve water quality by purifying what these plants will be taking in. Rain gardens can really transform an area. Whether you're looking at a large area that you want to come alive with healthy soil and rain garden species, such as this space downtown Moncton that the PWA worked on last summer, or even a smaller rain garden on the side of your house can make a huge difference in your landscape. Here is just the difference between the about the same amount of rain from just a recently excavated strip of land beside a new development. And in the top right corner, you can see with just a little bit of work, we put some bioretention soil mix, and we were just starting to put in a lot of different rain garden species. And I really enjoy coming back after the rain to see the difference. And this was pretty incredible. So when these water-loving native plants grow, their roots will encourage water to infiltrate through the soil instead of running over the land. And this purifies the water by taking out some pollutants and capturing some things like hazardous pollutants such as heavy metals. Rain gardens have been researched to taking things out like copper, zinc, mercury, capturing suspended sediment that would have just flown right into local streams or even your sewage system, as well as anthropogenic microparticles, including microplastics, and nutrients such as phosphate and nitrate that can be dangerous and create dead zones if they overflow into streams and rivers. causing havoc on Atlantic, but also aquatic species and ecosystems there. Plants also have different root systems, and after seeing all of Rosemary's really beautiful paintings, I feel very self-conscious by doing this myself. But here's a whole bunch of different root systems that you can see. Depending on the species, you can have taproot, you can have deep root systems, and also rhizonal growth, which is the horizontal, and they'll pop up little pups as they go along. So having a really biodiverse set in your rain garden community can really help make these much more effective. And much, much better than usual turf lawn. I tried to also see on the corners there, it is just incredible the difference. Some turf lawn can be so compact too that they almost act as if they're impervious surfaces themselves. And you can see stormwater run right off of them in huge rainfalls. So with all this knowledge, I know that you're ready to build a rain garden now, right? Get ready because you're gonna love it. So first off, I'll go over a few tips that you might use to get started. But before anything else, invest in some really great rain boots. You'll thank me later. Also grab your favorite shovel. If you don't have a favorite shovel, therein lies a problem, and you should probably go get one. A great way to get familiar with the space that you would like a rain garden is to get down in the dirt and see what kind of soil you're working with. Textures and whatnot. So you can do this by using a simple infiltration test or even a ribbon test. If you're not afraid to, hold in some soil and see what you have. So I also must say that the graphic at the bottom left, the infiltration test, is from Shediac Bay Watershed Association's Rain Garden Guide, which if you're a beginner or you've done a few rain gardens, if you know nothing or you know a lot, I highly recommend getting your hands on this guide because it is absolutely incredible. So you can do an infiltration test, just dig a hole 30 centimeters deep, fill it with water, cover it so nobody falls in, and come back the next day to see if it's still there. Or if you feel so inclined, just dig a little bit, grab some soil in your hands, and put a little bit of water to it and see if you can ribbon it between your thumb and forefinger. Depending on how long you have, if it's about 6 centimeters, you probably are working with some clay. And in the infiltration test, if you still see water after 24 hours, it is likely that you're working in an area with a lot of clay, or it could be a high water table, or the hydraulic heads. See, I was paying attention to John's PowerPoint. So these areas are not recommended for rain gardens. You can, and it is possible if you use bioretention soil to make them very effective, but they might be better suited to something like a retention pond or a bioswale that would be better suited to being submerged in water for a long period of time. Next, look around. Where is your water traveling? Maybe visit the space in the rain to see where things pool, if the soil is kind of having little divots in it and the water is traveling quickly or, aggressively somewhere. Where are your impermeable surfaces, such as pavement and rooftops? If you can calculate the area of these surfaces, and you can do this on Google Earth very easily, it can help you determine the best size for your garden. It's recommended about 20% your rain garden should be of an area that drains into it. If you're working in clay and you are taking the bio-retention soil next step, I'd recommend bumping that up to 30%, and rain gardens should be no smaller than about 5% of the drainage area that's going into them. The Department of Environment and Local Government also just released a really nifty flood hazard map for the province. I highly recommend checking this out, whether you're planning a rain garden or not. But if you are in a flood zone, it's not recommended to build a rain garden, though they can withstand a lot. In flood zones, it would be better suited to have something like an overflow drain and underground water system that you're kind of weaving gray and green infrastructure together. We've done such a project, and it is quite costly, so it would come down to budget, to be sure. Also, safety first. Don't put any shovels in the ground before you get the free surveys done by Enbridge and your local power company, and be power around here. Making sure there's no underground wires is safe for you and your team. So I make sure to get a locate permit from Enbridge before any of our projects. Here's an area we worked on in the city of Moncton, which was one of my first gardens. This was after a big rainfall event. And this is after a couple of years. So this is fresh after a rain. I love going back and visiting and seeing how everything's growing and what's spreading and, you know, what might need a little bit more mulch or touch up on the rocks, but it is really nice to continue to watch these things grow. So there are many ways that you can build a rain garden, and it is a great project to get creative with. You can have some fun trying to, you know, bring streams of water from your pipe on the side of your house to the rain garden, or towards a forest from there too. Or you could be like my supervisor, Darlene, and be really, really incredible at artistic rock designs, like the one that she did on the bottom right there. If you want some experience and you're nervous to take on your first rain garden, I would encourage you to reach out to your local Watershed group. Maybe they're tackling a rain garden this summer. I know that we are for sure, and we're always looking for volunteers. So I'd like to say thank you to our funders that help us make these environmental projects possible. As well, thank you to all the amazing groups and individuals who helped plan today. This is really an incredible workshop. I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you everyone else for joining us.
Thank you, Brittany.
Merci beaucoup, Brittany. Donc,
Thank you very much, Brittany. So we will proceed with the next presentation. Presentation will be with Jolene Hébert. She works with the Bay of Shediac Watershed Association. She's managed project on rain water and education representation will allow you to learn how to transport a feed 55-gallon in a system of rain water collection. Charlene. Thank you very much.
So much, Brittany, for the shout out, and Rosemary for that shout out too. But Brittany is being way too modest. She's the one that I turn to when I need help with my rain garden projects. So I am going to share my screen. My apologies if there's a background noise. I have a tractor in the parking lot. I'm hoping he's moving away though. Let's see. Okay. All right, so thank you so much for joining today. I am going to talk about rainwater harvesting and more specifically how to build your own rain barrel. So why install a rain barrel? Well, we have talked a lot about water today and the importance of water, keeping our water clean and keeping our precious resource of drinking water viable for the future. So why would you install a rain barrel? Well, they are a simple way for us to collect rainwater that runs off our rooftops. So they can actually help us conserve drinking water by using that rainwater for other uses. So if you're not using your potable water and using your rainwater, then you're effectively conserving that drinking water. So you can use it for watering your flowers, your lawn, your vegetable gardens, washing your car, or washing outdoor items where you don't necessarily need that pristine drinking water to use. And of course, the list can go on and on. but also it's like a double benefit because you can conserve drinking water, but it also helps reduce stormwater runoff. And we've talked quite a bit about stormwater runoff today when we touched on like how our plants, vegetation, and our soil helps to mitigate stormwater runoff and our rain gardens. But a rain barrel can also help with that by getting that water right at the source, right at that impervious surface that is our rooftops. So it will help to reduce the quantity of rainwaters that enter our storm drains. And if enough people in a community have a rain garden, a rain barrel installed on their downspout, it can help reduce the risk of flooding, because if we're talking about all of these impervious surfaces, which are all those rooftops, and you can capture 55 gallons if that barrel fills up in one massive rainstorm. Well, if you have enough 55-gallon barrels all around your community, that adds up, and that can really accumulate to making a really good positive impact to protect ourselves from flooding. Also, it helps to reduce the damage that's related to erosion around our property just by capturing that runoff right at the edge of that downspout before it keeps going. So you're really protecting your foundation and these different drainage paths around your property. And its overall management of runoff from any impervious surfaces will help protect water quality for wildlife and recreational uses. So for ourselves and our wildlife. So we all know that when the water leaves our rooftop and it keeps going, it runs across various different surfaces. Some are man-made, some are natural, but those that are man-made, such as paved driveways and paved roads, will often contain different contaminants that can come from our vehicles. So as the rainwater drops and as it flows over those surfaces, it actually washes away all of those pollutants and carries that into our storm drains. So if we're minimizing the amount of water that is leaving our rooftops, we're effectively reducing that threat to water quality. So this is why, oh, sorry about that. My animations are off. So this is why the Shediac Bay Watershed Association has had this rain barrel distribution program since 2016, funded by the New Brunswick Environmental Trust Fund, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada's program Eco Action. Since 2016, we've started distributing free barrels to citizens that live within our watershed. And the first 2 years, we distributed the first type, which is the first photo on the left, which is the collapsible kind. They are somewhat expensive, and they have their pros and cons. Primarily, pros is it's easily collapsible, so it's collapsible, so you can easily store it, and it's easy to clean. But the cons is that it's not as durable as a hard plastic barrel that might last a lifetime. So we transitioned a couple of years after gaining some experience in the program. We transitioned to the use of the plastic barrels, and we modified these plastic barrels into rainwater harvesting systems, which I'm going to explain how we do that today. So just one more slide on that project. This map is not quite up to date. I have all the barrels that have been distributed between 2016 and 2019. So I'm effectively missing about 35 points here, 35 barrels on this map, but you can see just how many barrels like this one program can make and can have. And you see that there are some points outside of our watershed. As much as possible, we try to keep our barrels within the watershed. But I mean, when you have a contest, you know, sometimes it can leave our borders just a little bit. But you can see that concentration of rainwater harvesting in like the municipality, which is where we have the most impervious cover percentage wise, where we have all of that development. So in my opinion, that really adds up to some significant stormwater management. So how to build a rain barrel? So here's our material list and tools list. So the first thing that you're going to need, of course, to build your rain barrel is a 55-gallon food grade plastic barrel. And food grade, we will discuss a little bit more in the later slides why it's so important, but basically we want to try to avoid any kinds of chemicals in our in the rainwater that we're harvesting. And you will find that the food grade symbol that's printed in the plastic below, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the top right-hand corner, we have some symbols there, and it's that food grade plastic. It's the goblet and the fork. So you're really looking for that goblet and fork that's printed on the bottom of that barrel. And you want to ask your provider what was in that barrel beforehand. Was it a food product or was it a chemical? So you really want to have a barrel that was used for a food product prior to being recycled and sold to you. Next, we're going to need a 3/4 inch garden hose faucet, preferably made out of metal and not plastic for durability. A 3/4 inch PVC bulkhead coupler. That is how we're going to install the faucet, as you will see later on. We'll need some Teflon tape, some duct tape, and we will create also a flower pot filter. Very, very simple. I'll show you in a little bit, which you'll need 6-inch flower pots. You'll need 2, those with the holes in the bottom, and some bug screen. The tools you will need a drill, a hole saw bit that is 1 3/8 inch, a jigsaw, a tape measure, a marker, some scissors, and a broomstick, and you'll see why. So the first step is to create the entrance hole for your water, where you will direct your downspout towards the entrance. So you're going to take the bottom of your flower pot, that 6-inch, which is going to measure out that hole nicely, make a circle with your marker, and then you can use your hole saw to create that first entrance so that you can insert that jigsaw blade. Next, you're going to use your jigsaw to cut the hole around following that line that you just drew. And then you can flip the barrel on its side once that hole is made. And then with your tape measure, you're going to measure 3 inches from the bottom and put a dot at that 3-inch line just to see where you're going to install your faucet. You're going to use your hole saw bit again to drill the hole, a very precise hole so that there's no leak and that your coupler will fit perfectly. When you're going to use your hole saw bit, there's a center kind of an anchor point, and you're going to put that anchor point right on the dot that you drew. Here is where the broomstick comes in handy. Now that you've drilled the hole where your coupler is going to be, you have 2 parts to your coupler, or actually 3, but the part that will go inside the barrel, your top of the barrel doesn't come off. So you cannot actually reach down with your arm and install that. So we've determined this little trick where you can use a broomstick or whatever kind of stick you have, even if it's a hockey stick, use a piece of duct tape in kind of a roll there, just to stick that piece of the coupler that needs to go inside, and use that to reach down into the barrel, as you can see, and to direct that where it's supposed to go and push that forward. Once that is installed, there is that third piece that I was mentioning, which is just basically kind of a seal or a washer, I guess, made of rubber. And then you're going to screw on the outside piece of the coupler just to keep that stable as tightly as you can. And now for the installation of the tap, you're going to use your Teflon tape and put 3 to 4 layers, or even a little bit more if you want, all around to help prevent leaks all around the thread part of that tap. And then you're going to twist that tap right into that coupler piece and twist until it is tight and facing downwards. For your flower pot filter, you're going to cut 2 pieces of bug net or bug screening, place them together in like as shown in the photo. Place that on top of one of your flower pots, and use the second flower pot and just insert that right on top and press it downwards and align the holes so that you have those two aligned. So you can tell that between the two flower pots, you have this nice bug screening that will help keep bugs and debris such as leaves and such outside of your rain barrel. And then you just place your flower pot inside. And if you see that it doesn't go down as much as you want, you can just make some more adjustments with your jigsaw to make sure that your flower pot fits well. Now your barrel is finished. This is what it will look like, and you are ready to install it. Now you might have to make some adjustments to your downspout, such as cutting it shorter and then installing an elbow so that you can direct the water towards your barrel. Now this barrel that's in the middle picture is not elevated up on a stand, and I think that that was a maybe not recommended because it's going to be hard to fill a watering can with the tap being so low to the ground. However, they did modify their downspout just to direct the water where it's supposed to be. But the third example is much better, where you see that they found a very solid looking bench and some kind of a slab underneath. So you can tell that that is really stable. And they've elevated the barrel where you have lots of room there to put a watering can or a bucket so that you can, you know, access your water. And that downspout looks very nicely modified where it goes directly into that flower pot. So that is a perfect installation in my opinion. I don't own the rights to these photos. It's just something that I found online. But these are some ideas of how you can expand with that simple barrel and create additional overflow areas to connect one barrel to another. So again, you would just use that same hole saw and create a hole closer to the top where once the first barrel fills up, it just redirects water towards the next, and then you're just basically increasing your storage capacity to hold a whole lot more water. So the ideas are endless. So some tips and tricks for the installation and the maintenance. So before the winter, empty the barrel completely before storage. And here's a tip: if you don't have a garage, turn the barrel upside down or cover it with a tarp just to make sure that no water gets inside. Once it freezes, we all know about expansion, it will damage the plastic that is your barrel and will make it weaker with time. Never use your barrels that have been previously used to store toxic substances. As I mentioned earlier, food grade only. Never use collected water for drinking, cooking, or bathing. We don't know what kind of chemicals can be found on our roof shingles, bacteria and other chemicals that I'm sure there could be a long list of. I'm not completely sure, but so for that same reason, when you're watering a vegetable garden, pour the water onto the soil and not directly onto the plants. That is some advice that you can find online when you're looking to build your own rain barrel and uses for a rain barrel. That is the suggested action to prevent from contaminating your food. So install that on a solid base, such as cement blocks, to elevate it, like I said earlier, so that you can fill a watering can and also increase the flow rate. So the higher you install a rain barrel, the more pressure you might have. So if you want to connect a hose to the faucet to direct the water towards your garden, you'll have more gravity gravity pressure, I guess, to bring your water where you want it. Ensure that the base is level for your safety. Remember that a 55-gallon barrel can weigh up to 300 pounds when it's full. So if it is not level and that falls, that can really be a safety hazard and maybe injure someone. And install a filter to prevent insects and debris from entering. We created a YouTube video when we built that, when we built our rain barrels, so you can find that on our YouTube page. If you want to revisit this to get the materials list and to refresh your memory when it comes the time to build your own rain barrel. As you can see, it is quite simple, but there are some measurements that you might want to remember. where to buy a food grade barrel. We buy all of our barrels from Eco Container Company. It is a company in Dorchester run by Max McNichols. His email address is on the screen. You can find his page on Facebook. He doesn't have a website, just a Facebook page, but I would like to make a note that on his Facebook page, which I will send him an email about, it is his old email, which is maxjax@rogers.com, but it is now a Gmail email that he uses primarily. So I will let him know that he needs to update his contact information on Eco Container Company website. And that's it for me. If there are any questions, if we have time, or I will be available later.
Thank you, Jolene. Once again, everyone unmute themselves.